She walked into the café like a small fact the room hadn't yet decided what to do with. Steam curled from cups. A bell over the door chimed. Light lay in a strip across the tiled floor, warming crumbs and the scuff marks left by so many feet before hers. Emily's prosthetic foot tapped once, then twice, searching for a place that would hold her without asking too many questions. Her hand lingered on the back of a chair, as if making sure the world wouldn't slide away if she reached for it. People glanced up, practiced their smiles, and looked away. The barista called out orders. A couple at a corner table bent over a laptop. Someone laughed at a message on their phone. The cafes smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon. The chair she held looked ordinary. The chair felt like possibility. She asked, quietly, as if the word might break glass, "Can I sit here?" They said no in half a dozen ways. A woman with a stroller murmured that the bench was for customers only. A student with headphones shifted his bag to show ownership. A man in a suit told her the table was reserved. The refusals were not loud. They were mechanical, practiced politeness that adds up to absence. Each small denial tightened the line at Emily's mouth. Each refusal made the prosthetic tap seem louder in the room. At another table, a man in a leather vest folded his hands around a mug and watched without deciding she ought to move on. He had the sort of face people guessed at, weathered but not unkind. He didn't look surprised when she kept standing. He simply pushed his chair back enough for her to squeeze by and said, the words steady and small, "Sit." She sat as if she'd been given permission to breathe. The leather of his vest creaked. He kept his hands flat on the table so she could see they were empty. He didn't flinch when she put her bag on the floor with the careful motion of someone mapping exits. He did not ask personal questions. He ordered nothing. He waited. That waiting, uncomplicated and patient, was what she needed first. Across the table, steam fogged the mug between them. Marcus, because that was his name, looked at her hands, a thinness to the wrists that spoke of small meals, careful rationing. He glanced at the prosthetic foot where the rubber tip had worn into a shallow crescent, and a small dark mark on her forearm that made her pull the sleeve down. Small things, each with a story that might be a story at all or might be invisible to everyone else. He kept his voice low. "What's your name?" "Emily," she said, and the syllables carried the economy of someone who'd learned to speak only what was asked. He asked if she wanted hot chocolate. She nodded. She chose grilled cheese because the menu looked safe and blunt and like something that could be eaten with clean hands. The barista, Sophie, watched with a tilt of the head that knew when someone had been at a cafe before without being welcomed.
Sophie had sometimes seen her in the mornings, a glimpse through the rain or the door as it opened. Today she stepped over, apron smudged with flour, and placed the mug down with a little more care than the espresso machine might have required. They began with food and small things, the way a person's fingers curled around a warm cup, the way their knees allowed the chair to be steady. Emily's voice came in short sentences at first. She answered questions with the economy of a child who had learned not to expand rooms she might have to leave. Marcus did not press. He folded questions into the rhythm of a conversation so she wouldn't be surprised by their arrival. Between bites, she glanced toward the door. Marcus noticed the way her fingers played at the seam where the prosthetic met skin. A little redness had collected there, the kind that suggested an ill-fitting socket. Once, when someone dropped a tray, she flinched so convincingly she made the sugar shaker rattle. He watched that flinch like it was a clue for a map. He heard her mention, almost in passing, "He locks the pantry," and "I count when I'm hungry," and "The boxes are in the closet." Words that, in a child's voice, were plain as weather, but heavy as proof if someone listened. The pattern of refusal at the cafe had been the first wrong thing. The second was what the refusals hid, a pattern at home. Marcus didn't leap to accusation. He had seen enough to know that urgency needed evidence, and that evidence needed careful collection if it was to be trusted by the people who could do something about it. He also had those hands and that vest, and a network of other people who knew how to move without becoming the story themselves. He bought another grilled cheese and a coffee for Sophie, who hovered with a napkin and an understanding look. Then he made one simple choice. He asked her if she wanted to call someone. She shook her head. She didn't have the pattern of asking for help. She had the habit of keeping records in her head. Outside the window, the bikes idled like patient animals. Marcus had ridden into this town 10 years earlier and found it the kind of place where neighbors shoved groceries within reach, and also the kind of place where people learned to look away. He kept his phone in his pocket like a tool, and now, feeling the undeniable tilt of something wrong, he called Brick. Brick answered on the second ring. "You see her?" he asked, voice blunt and precise. "Yeah," Marcus said. He didn't need to soften the truth. He gave the few facts as they were. A child in the cafe, a worn prosthetic, a flinch, something about locked food. Brick listened and then, without drama, said he'd roll out with Ghost and Tank. He asked Marcus to photograph what he could, not in a way that would make the child feel observed, but in a way that preserved what professionals would later need: the prosthetics wear, the mark on the arm, the scuffed seam of the clothing, the exact words she used.
Sophie stepped in gently, snapping a wide-angle photo that captured the scene. She made it feel like a picture of the café, not a mugshot. Marcus wrote down times and quotes on a napkin. He noted what Emily said and what she didn't say. Good evidence, he thought, was a string of small, honest things. The bikers arrived in ways that seemed orchestrated by habit rather than by plan. Ghost carried a thermos and a patient gaze. Tank shifted a bulkier presence toward the back, quiet and steady. They came not as an armored cavalry, but as neighbors with a reputation for showing up and for knowing how to call the right people. Brick read the notes, asked a few clarifying questions, and then pulled out his phone. He had a calm way of translating urgency into tasks. Sophie, take a statement about the times she'd seen the girl. Marcus, keep her talking about favorite things. Ghost, check the kid's backpack for anything that might indicate school records. Tank, check the surrounding block for signs of where she disappeared to. As they moved, they kept the child at the center, not as a spectacle, but as someone whose comfort and safety determined the pace. Marcus played quiet games. A tiny paper crane folded together, a story about a dog who loved puddles. A distracted laugh escaped Emily at one of his jokes, a small thing like a plant getting a droplet of water. Those small human noises are sometimes the loudest proof that a child is still inside an otherwise careful shell. When they were ready, Marcus styled Daniels. Daniels had been an officer, then something like a myth in town, an ex-cop who now taught procedure and sat on mutual aid boards. He answered with the measured brevity of someone who'd spent long nights gathering facts. Marcus conveyed the observations in the order that mattered for action: the child's physical state, the observed behaviors, the claims about locked food and a bolted door, the ledger mention she had said in passing. Daniels asked the questions that would matter to a welfare investigator: any visible injuries, the child's preferred name for the adult in the home, times when the child was left alone. He took notes. He told Marcus he would call the local CPS unit and the patrol sergeant and asked Marcus to preserve any evidence and to resist taking enforcement action himself. That last point, resisting vigilantism, was a line the bikers knew to hold. They had seen in other towns the way good intentions can become dangerous when folks take the law into their own hands. They were used to stepping back until the proper warrants arrived because the most important victories were the ones backed by law and care. Brick relayed to the group an outline of tasks: document, corroborate, keep the child safe, call witnesses. Someone offered to stay with Emily while others checked nearby properties for signs of how the household operated. Neighbors provided small, grainy data points that added up. Sophie remembered the child showing up for a single cookie once, hungry and apologetic, and then not again. A woman in an upstairs flat produced a photo of the child waiting by a mailbox. The timestamp gave an idea of routine. A man from across the street said he'd heard yelling twice late at night, but assumed it was neighbors arguing. Each recollection was careful, like handling something fragile. Brick cataloged the statements, each one a tile in a mosaic that began to look like neglect rather than single bad night. At the same time, Marcus and Ghost took a careful inventory of what they could see in Emily's bag: a school schedule with some dates crossed out, a small notebook where she'd written lunch beside 2 days of the week, and a folded note with a name that might have been an address. Ghost handled the documents as if they were pieces of evidence in a case they hadn't yet called a case. He photographed, time-stamped, and backed files up to a secure account so nothing would be lost. When Daniels called back, he had set wheels in motion. He relayed to Marcus the name of the CPS investigator assigned, the time a duty sergeant could check in, and what the initial protocol would be if the pattern could be corroborated. Welfare check, need for documented statements, petition for a warrant if the living conditions or records suggested deliberate deprivation. "We need a reasonable belief," Daniel said. "We can't just remove a child because people feel sorry. We need evidence, and we need to do it right so the child doesn't get shifted around more than she already has." They waited for professionals to do the things only professionals can do. That wait was not passive. It was a humming factory of attention. Calls, notes, protection of the child's privacy, kindness given without spectacle. Marcus let Emily talk about small daily things: the taste of grilled cheese, the sound of the bus brakes, and in that listening she taught them things about her life. She told a story about a paper boat she'd once set in a puddle and then watched the rain invaded. She laughed at the memory, and when she laughed, her shoulders unfurled as if she'd been waiting to discover whether anyone would keep the space safe for that sound. When CPS arrived, they did so with clipboards and the language of procedure. The investigator, Lena, introduced herself softly and asked Emily some questions in a voice that made it possible to answer without being put on trial. Lena observed the prosthetic, the redness where it met skin, and asked who would get the prosthesis checked.
Marcus replied that he would help get her to a clinic and that he'd already spoken to someone who knew prosthetic technicians. Lena's notebook filled with neutral statements and dates, what Emily said, what neighbors said, what the cafe staff observed. She asked the same questions twice in different ways to test consistency, a standard technique to ensure reliability.
The pattern became clearer after Lena spoke with neighbors, Sophie and the bikers. The pantry behind the house, it turned out, was padlocked, and the child had described being given a single cup of milk at selected times. A ledger was mentioned. Emily had, in passing, said, "My uncle writes the days down." When the team obtained access to the house with a welfare warrant, they found the pantry locked, a bolt on the child's door, and a small notebook that contained dates and times with notes about food and outings. The notebook's entries were clinical and tidy, a ledger that tracked presence and absence in a way that made food into something rationed by calculation. The investigators were careful to document everything with the same attention they'd used in the cafe: photographs where appropriate, descriptions where necessary, and chain of custody procedures so that nothing could be contested later. Marcus did not enter the house without a warrant. He and the bikers kept to their role. They stood by, their presence a buffer so the child did not feel abandoned in a sea of uniforms. The patrol sergeant read the warrant aloud to the adult on site and then escorted the uncle out of the house. He was questioned and later arrested on charges consistent with neglect. The case would move through the court system with the slow gravity those things require. Emily was taken to the hospital for an initial assessment. The staff there were a different kind of calm, clinical, steady, focused on immediate medical needs. Dr. Rivera, a pediatric prosthetist, examined the socket. She explained in plain terms what she saw: pressure points where the socket chafed, an alignment issue that made a child favor one side and could cause long-term complications if left untreated. She adjusted the socket in ways that were practical and immediate, and she scheduled follow-ups for proper fitting. A pediatrician checked for signs of malnutrition and treated minor sores where the prosthetic had rubbed raw. The language in the hospital stayed practical: no judgment, only a plan: rest, nutrition, wound care, and a referral to a trauma-informed therapist. Marcus sat in the hospital waiting room and watched Emily sleep in a cot the color of hospital eggshells. He called Brick and told him simply, "She's here. They're taking care of the prosthetic." Brick hummed a low, almost relieved sound. The bikers had done what they did best. They noticed, they kept presence, they connected people. But Marcus knew the work wasn't finished. The law would have to do its part, and then the slow work of repair would begin. A social worker named Alina took Emily's intake. She asked about family, about school, about people Emily trusted. Marcus offered his name as someone the child had identified as safe.
Alina explained what would happen next: placement decisions, forensic interviews done gently, a medical record with all findings, and a court hearing to determine custody or protective placement. She emphasized the importance of stability for the child and the need to make decisions that would support long-term bonding rather than rapid shifts in accommodation. At the same time, legal machinery began to move. Daniels provided the statements and the documentation from the cafe and the neighbors to the prosecutor's office. Warrants and logs were filed. Evidence, the ledger, the locked pantry, the photographs of the prosthetic's wear, were cataloged and submitted. The prosecutor considered charges and the necessity of a protective order. The town's family court docket was informed. An initial hearing was scheduled so that the judge could determine immediate custody and care plans. When the court date came, the courtroom had the sanitized hush of important things being decided. Judge Patricia Chen presided with gentleness that carried the authority of someone who understood the stakes of her words. Marcus sat in the spectator row, hands folded, while Emily was accompanied by the social worker. The prosecutor laid out the evidence in careful, non-inflammatory terms: documented deprivation of food, patterns of locked access to the home, and a ledger evidencing deliberate rationing. The uncle's defense offered explanations that were messy and partial. The judge listened, then turned her focus to what would give Emily the best chance of recovery. There are moments in court that are procedural, but also profoundly human. The judge asked Emily a simple question in a voice that invited truth without forcing it. "Who do you feel safe with?" she asked. Emily's answer was short and quiet, and it carried the weight of the small choices that matter. "Marcus," she said, and the word hung in the air like a claim. The judge then asked Alina about Marcus's suitability. The social worker outlined Marcus's community ties, his stable living situation, and his network of people willing to take on the kinds of tasks that make support not a single event, but a life maintained. Marcus did not ask for special recognition. He had not sought to be in court.
He had simply been a person who sat down when someone needed a seat. The judge issued a protective placement order that allowed Emily to be placed with a vetted kinship-like arrangement under the supervision of CPS, with Marcus granted visitation and an assigned path toward guardianship if evaluations supported it. The legal wording was precise: oversight, regular reviews, mandated services such as therapy and prosthetic care, and checks to ensure the child's schooling and health were stabilized. It wasn't a fairy tale adoption, it was a legal scaffold that could be built on with good work. Treatment plans can read like lists, but each line contains the slow labor of undoing harm.
Emily's plan included physical therapy to address gait and balance, a program from Dr. Rivera for prosthetic refitting and adjustment, nutrition monitoring, and trauma-focused therapy to address the psychological consequences of chronic neglect. The bike club members created a roster: who would drive Emily to appointments, who would help with school drop-offs, who would sit with her when nights stretched long. Brick turned spreadsheets into acts of care, a calendar that wasn't just dates, but a promise. Therapy was not a light switch. The first sessions were about trust. The therapist named small, manageable things and let Emily tell stories she wanted to tell. The therapist, a woman named Rosa, used play-based approaches to help Emily make maps of her feelings and taught breathing techniques for when she felt the world tilt. Marcus learned to sit quietly during sessions. His presence was a steadying thing for Emily, and to practice new routines: consistent bedtimes, predictable meals, an evening ritual of reading a chapter from a book together. Those routines, repeated, became scaffolding. At the prosthetics clinic, the adjustments were iterative. Dr. Rivera swapped sockets, tried materials that reduced friction, adjusted alignment, and told Emily that the foot would feel different each day as the body adapted. Physical therapy meant small victories: standing unassisted for an extra minute, walking a step without thinking he was measuring an exit, learning to hop on one foot with concentration that dissolved into glee. Each forward motion arrived only after repetition. Stretching, strengthening, balance drills meant to retrain muscles grown lax from compensatory patterns. Marcus learned to hold a phone in one hand and a bag of therapy bands in the other, to stop mid-conversation and give a hand when Emily needed help tying a shoelace. The bikers became family in practical ways. Sunday morning saw a rotation of rides that ended at a park where Emily could watch engines from a safe distance and then run along a path with someone jogging beside her. Ghost taught her to identify tool names and handed her a small spanner that she kept like a trophy. Tank brought over old picture books and read with a slow cadence that matched Emily's new rhythm. Sophie began text updates, pictures of Emily sitting on a low stool at the café making paper boats, a string of small images that together painted a life that felt increasingly ordinary. They also had to navigate bureaucracies. The clinic required consent forms, the school needed records and a plan to support Emily in class, and the legal system demanded progress reports. Marcus went to meetings with social workers and therapists, taking quiet notes. He learned the jargon of support plans and guardianship. He filled out forms, sat through evaluations, and answered questions about stability and capacity.
He learned to talk about finances in the language that CPS expected, to show bank statements and living arrangements, to present not a romance of rescue, but a credible path to safety. Not all moments were clean and conclusive. There were nights when Emily woke up shaking, small shapings of old fears. There were times when the uncle's name came up in a lull, and she would clutch a stuffed animal and be suddenly small. Therapy sessions sometimes surfaced grief and confusion. Marcus would sit through those moments and let the silence be held rather than filled. He learned that presence sometimes just meant being a chair in the room. Progress showed itself in rituals. The first breakfast at the house was a simple triumph: pancakes that weren't rationed, syrup spread too thick. There was a day when Emily set the table and then sat back like someone surveying a landscape she had shaped. A bathroom mirror ritual involved new toothpaste tubes and the slow relearning of how to brush with a prosthetic foot planted solidly on a mat. Habits like school bags laid out the night before, a calendar with stickers for therapy days, and a small jar where Emily dropped a pebble every time she could name a feeling, all became a geography of recovery. One autumn, the bikers threw a modest birthday party. It wasn't a spectacle. A cake was homemade. Candles were two thick sparklers that hissed in a way that made Emily squeal. The motorcycles were parked at a respectful distance, like guests in an open-air audience. People came with small gifts: socks with cartoons, a book of puzzles, a stuffed fox. Marcus watched her blow out the candles as if he were watching a tide he had never met before find the shore. "Happy birthday," he said. She smiled so wide it rearranged her face. "I'm home," she said later that night, and the words landed like a settled thing. Months passed, and the routines deepened.
The prosecutor's office continued with the case. The uncle faced the charges, which would be adjudicated through legal processes designed to weigh evidence and assign responsibility. The court required updates: how treatment was proceeding, whether the living arrangement supported the child's best interests, and whether the guardianship path should continue to be pursued. Marcus complied with home studies, with background checks, and with social workers' visits. He learned to accept that the system would move at its own pace, and that patience was not the same as passivity. There were hard practicalities, too. Insurance paperwork argued for coverage and sometimes delayed prosthetic fittings. Donations and fundraising helped bridge gaps. The bikers organized a benefit ride that paid for a new set of socket liners and a replacement foot when Emily outgrew the one she had. People in the neighborhood pitched in for textbooks, shoes, and a pair of winter mittens that had a rainbow knit across the wrist. Small acts, repeated, add up to shelter. Recovery was not linear.
There were days when Emily regressed a bit, a stray comment at school that stung, a clothing tag that reminded her of being too cold. There were nights of insomnia and afternoons of sudden bravery. The therapy notes recorded small wins and setbacks with an impartial hand. 3 sessions of improved sleep, a day where she played for 20 minutes without looking for exits, decreased frequency of flinches during loud noises. Marcus learned to take the notes in stride and to celebrate the small footfalls, an extra minute of unassisted standing, a new phrase like "I can try," which marked an internal shift from survival tactics to experimentation. Community rituals became part of the stitchwork holding them together. There was a Saturday when the bikers painted a low bench at the park in bright colors so it would be easy to spot. School staff provided Emily with a classroom buddy who checked in gently, and a teacher adjusted seating so she could access the room without awkwardness. The café hosted a small reading hour where Sophie read from picture books, and people volunteered to bring cookies. Each ritual was a signal: here are people who know you and who will keep returning. Years later, at a hearing designed to finalize longer-term arrangements, the judge looked at a file fat with notes and at faces who had become constants. "We have to be realistic about what a child needs," Judge Chen said. She praised the network's careful record-keeping and the social workers' assessments, and emphasized that custody decisions hinge on stability and the ability to meet a child's needs long-term. After reviewing evidence of Emily's progress, therapy reports, school assessments, medical updates, she approved a guardianship arrangement that allowed Marcus gradual parental rights under supervision and a plan for transition. It was not the end of oversight, it was a step toward normalcy. Months after the legal conclusion, Emily learned to hop on one foot across the kitchen tiles with a grin that was all the proof Marcus needed. She practiced running in short bursts in the park, her prosthetic calibrated to a new gait. Dr. Rivera smiled when Emily came in for a routine fitting and said, "You've outgrown this one, which is a good problem to have." The words had the kind of weight that comes from steady care. There were quieter payoffs, too. Once, while they were ironing out a school schedule, Emily tucked a photo into Marcus's hand, a drawing of a house with many doors and people lined up like a family. On the porch of that drawn house was a motorcycle with a ribbon tied to the handlebar. Marcus kept the drawing in the console of his bike. It was small, domestic evidence of belonging, a thing that would be useful on dark days. The town adjusted, too. People who had once looked away now waved as they biked by. Sophie began to open the café on a snowy morning for a breakfast fundraiser and posted the receipts online for transparency.
BIKER organized mentorships for other children in need of safe adults. The bikers trained with community organizations about how to handle calls that might involve children and how to collaborate with CPS and police rather than competing with them. They kept the line between citizen action and professional enforcement clear because they had seen how fragile a rescue could become without proper structure. In public conversations that followed, Marcus spoke little about heroism. He said plainly that he had been present when someone needed help and that the rest was a mix of community care and proper procedure. He emphasized the paperwork and the referrals, the hospital visits, the court dates, and the therapists. "You don't fix it in a day," he told an interviewer once, "but you can start by sitting down." There are practical lessons braided through this story. If you see something that looks like neglect, document what you can in neutral language, call the authorities who can act lawfully, provide immediate refuge without taking a child beyond what the law permits, and support longer-term care with concrete contributions, not just sympathy. These aren't grand pronouncements so much as step-by-step actions that make a life safer. The most lasting thing was the quiet, ordinary life they built together. School concerts where Emily clapped at the right moments, quiet breakfasts where she instructed Marcus on the perfect amount of syrup, a laundry list of appointments turned into a calendar with stickers that indicated progress. There were arguments, scheduling mistakes, the tedium of therapy days, but those were the fabric of family, the unromantic cloth that speeds into normalcy. On an evening with rain tapping against the window, Emily wandered into the living room with her socks mismatched and a book in her hand. She perched on the couch, stretched out one small leg past a cushion, and said with an ease that had taken months to grow, "I'm home."
Marcus closed the book they'd been reading and watched the light fill the room. The word home was not a finality, it was an ongoing verb in their house. It meant plates on the table, stitches in the schedule, visits to doctors and school staff, and the occasional boredom that proves consistency. It meant the presence of a community that had decided not to leave them alone. It meant systems, CPS, medical professionals, the court, working in tandem with neighbors who could show up when it mattered. If there is a moral thread here, it is not the glamorous one of a single savior. It is the less photogenic truth that rescue is rarely the product of one person's bravery alone. It is the weaving together of quiet acts, a hand that says sit, a barista who remembers, a neighbor who provides a time-stamped photo, a social worker who protects, a doctor who adjusts, a judge who recognizes continuity, and a group of bikers who keep showing up. Those pieces, arranged with patience and legal backing, became a neck.
There is also an explicit charge embedded in the story. Don't look away. The polite refusals in the cafe were not cruelties so much as inattention. It is easier to avoid responsibility by assuming someone else will act, but small refusals accumulate. An attentive person can convert noticing into action that leads to evidence and then to lawful protection. If you see a child who seems isolated, document what you can, call local protective services, and offer safe, non-judgmental presence while professionals assess. Links to reputable child protection hotlines and resources are in the description below. They did not promise miracles. Emily did not spring fully healed from the hospital bed. There were steady appointments, nights of worry, and paperwork that sometimes felt endless. But the arc of the story was not spectacular so much as durable. Slow, steady care, and a community that refused to treat the child as invisible. Years after the first grilled cheese was shared at a cafe table, Emily learned to swing her prosthetic foot over a bicycle pedal and push off. Her laugh, when it came, was freer. She made a friend at school who liked the same puzzle book. The bikers taught a class at the community center on how to build supportive networks that partner with institutions rather than replace them. In the end, the most shocking thing was not the initial harm, but the ordinary power of a simple act to change the course of a life. A single word, sit, became the hinge. It invited trust into a small space and allowed evidence to be gathered, authorities to be called, and professionals to do their work. It created a path from neglect to care that was legal and measured and, above all, sustained. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. Noticing matters. Acting matters. Staying matters. Protection is not always dramatic. It is the repetition of ordinary things, meals that are real, appointments kept, soft hands to hold, done over time. People who want to help should learn to translate compassion into the language institutions understand, documentation, calls to the right services, and offers of practical support that respect the child's dignity. Share this story. Links to verified child protection resources are below.